On a cold, windy afternoon in the heart of the city, a family sat huddled together on a park bench, their faces drawn with exhaustion and worry. The air was thick with the weight of uncertainty. A father, his clothes ragged and worn, gently held his young daughter in his arms, trying to shield her from the biting chill. Beside him, his wife, her eyes hollow from hunger, clutched a small bag of belongings. The family had been struggling for weeks, moving from shelter to shelter, doing their best to survive. Every day felt like a battle, and every night was spent wondering where their next meal would come from. It wasn't just the hunger that weighed on them, it was the feeling of being invisible, overlooked by the world around them. People passed by without a second glance, as if the family didn't exist. But little did they know, today would be different. Today, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change everything. As the family sat there, trying to stay warm, a figure appeared out of nowhere, a man, dressed in a simple jacket, his face partially hidden by the hood he wore. He walked towards them with a calm, purposeful stride. At first, the family didn't notice him. They were too focused on their own struggles to notice anything else. But then, the man stopped in front of them and, without saying a word, handed them a bag. Inside, the family found a hot meal, fresh and ready to eat. It wasn't just any meal, it was a feast, something they hadn't had in what felt like forever. The father's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked up at the man, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Thank you, but why?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. The man smiled softly, but didn't answer. He simply nodded and turned to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. The family sat there in stunned silence, staring at the meal before them. It wasn't just the food that overwhelmed them, it was the kindness, the unexpected generosity of a stranger who had noticed their struggle and decided to make a difference. But as they ate, something gnawed at the back of their minds. Who was this man? Why had he helped them? And why had he walked away without a word? As the family finished their meal, a strange feeling lingered in the air. The man's gesture had been kind, but there was something about him that didn't quite add up. Who was he really? What was his story? And why had he chosen them, out of all the people he could have helped? Little did they know, the man's true identity was about to be revealed in a way that no one could have predicted. The answers to their questions would come, but not in the way they expected. The mystery surrounding this kind stranger would soon unfold, and the family's lives would be changed forever. Stay tuned to find out who this man really was, and what connection he had to the family's story. The truth is more surprising than anyone could have imagined. The family couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed after that day. The meal, so simple yet so meaningful, had been a rare moment of relief in their otherwise difficult lives. But it was more than just food. The kindness the stranger had shown them was like a spark of hope, something they hadn't felt in a long time. The father, David, couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why had he helped them? And why had he left so suddenly, without a word? David had always prided himself on being a protector. He had worked hard his whole life, doing whatever it took to provide for his family. But after losing his job and struggling to find another, things had taken a turn for the worse. His pride had taken a hit too. It wasn't easy for him to ask for help, but as the days turned into weeks and then into months, he had no choice. His wife, Sarah, had been even more reluctant to admit how much they were struggling. She had always been the backbone of the family, the one who kept everything together, even when times were tough. But now with their daughter, Lily, growing more and more hungry each day, Sarah had started to lose her sense of hope. It wasn't just the physical hunger, it was the emotional toll of seeing her family suffer. That day in the park, when the stranger had appeared, was a momentary escape from the harsh reality they were living. But it was also a reminder of just how much they had lost. The meal, though appreciated, had been a fleeting relief. As the family sat together in the small, run-down apartment they had been able to find, David couldn't help but feel that there was more to the stranger's gesture than met the eye. Later that evening, after they had finished eating, David sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The city lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. He had always believed that people were inherently good, that kindness could change the world. But the world had shown him the opposite. Every day had been a struggle, and now even the smallest act of kindness felt like a reminder of everything they had lost. David's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood up, his heart racing. It was late, and they weren't expecting anyone. He opened the door cautiously, and to his surprise, it was the stranger from earlier that day. The man stood there, his face still partially hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. His eyes were kind, but there was something else there, something that made David's stomach twist with unease. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "But I wanted to make sure you were okay. I know it's been a rough time for you." David didn't know what to say. How did this man know about their struggles? He had only met them for a few minutes earlier that afternoon. And yet, here he was, standing at their door, as if he knew everything about them. "We're fine," David replied, his voice guarded. "Thank you for the food earlier. It really meant a lot to us." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad it helped. But I know it's not enough. You need more than just food to get by." David's heart skipped a beat. The man's words felt like a punch to the gut. He had been trying so hard to hold everything together, to keep his family from falling apart. But the truth was, they were barely hanging on. The bills were piling up, the rent was overdue, and every day felt like a battle they couldn't win. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" the man asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Anything at all?" David hesitated. He didn't want to ask for help, not from a stranger. But the weight of the situation was too much to bear. "We don't have much," he said quietly. "We're just trying to get by, to make it through each day." The man seemed to understand. He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to David, who took it with trembling hands. The envelope was thick, heavy with something that felt like more than just paper. Inside, the man said, "You'll find what you need. It's not much, but it should help." David stared at the envelope, unsure of what to do. The man was already turning to leave, his footsteps soft against the floor as he made his way toward the door. Before he could say anything, the man paused and turned back to him. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But remember, there's always someone out there who cares. You're not alone." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. David stood there, the envelope still in his hands. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had he helped them? What was inside the envelope? He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the thick paper inside. As he read the note, his heart sank. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that David hadn't expected. It wasn't just money that the man had left him. It was a message that would change everything. "I know what you've been through," the note began, "and know what you're going through now. But you're not alone. You have a purpose, and I'm here to help you find it." David read the note again, his mind struggling to comprehend what it meant. What purpose? Who was this man, and how did he know so much about them? The questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was clear: the stranger wasn't just someone passing through their lives. He was connected to them in a way that David couldn't yet understand. Meanwhile, Sarah and Lily were in the other room, unaware of what had just happened. Sarah had been trying to calm Lily down, who had been crying for hours. The stress of their situation had taken its toll on her, and now the little girl couldn't sleep, her stomach growling with hunger. David walked into the room, still holding the envelope. He sat down beside Sarah, his mind racing with confusion and fear. "I don't know what's going on," he said quietly. "But something's not right. That man, he knows something. I don't know how, but he does." Sarah looked at him, her eyes tired but filled with concern. "What are you talking about? Who was he?" David shook his head, unable to explain. "I don't know." but I think he's connected to something bigger than we realize. Something we don't understand." Sarah's face softened. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "David, we're going to get through this." "We have to." For Lily. David nodded, but the unease still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far bigger than their own struggles. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "You have a purpose." But what did that mean? And what role did this mysterious man play in their lives? The night stretched on, and the family sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The world outside felt distant, as if they were trapped in a bubble of uncertainty. But one thing was certain, their lives were about to change, and the man who had shown them kindness was at the center of it all. The next day, David couldn't stop thinking about the envelope. He had tried to put it out of his mind, but the words on the paper haunted him. He had to know more. He had to find the man and get answers. But where was he? How could David find someone who had appeared out of nowhere, given them a gift, and then vanished just as quickly? David's search would lead him down a path he never could have imagined, a path that would uncover secrets, hidden truths, and a connection to his family's past that would change everything. But for now, he was still in the dark, his questions unanswered. And as the day wore on, the tension between David and Sarah grew. She could see the change in him, the worry, the confusion, the sense that something was coming, something they weren't prepared for. But David couldn't bring himself to tell her what was on his mind. He had to find the man first. He had to understand what was happening. But little did they know, the answers they sought were closer than they could have ever imagined. The stranger wasn't just a random act of kindness. He was a key to something much bigger, something that would soon reveal itself in a way no one could have predicted. And as the mystery deepened, so did the danger. The family was about to find themselves caught in a web of secrets, deception, and a past they never knew existed. The journey had just begun, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered. But would they be ready for it when it came? Days passed, and the unease in David's chest only grew. He couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious stranger and the cryptic message in the envelope. What was his purpose? Why had he singled them out? And why had he left so abruptly, without any explanation? David felt like he was on the edge of something, but he couldn't quite see what it was. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit together. Sarah noticed the change in him. She saw how distracted he had become, how his eyes seemed distant, always searching for something that wasn't there. She tried to reach out to him, but David kept pushing her away, lost in his thoughts. She had her own worries. Lily's health was deteriorating, and the weight of their situation was taking a toll on her as well. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just their financial struggles. One evening, as David sat alone, the doorbell rang. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight, the stranger standing on the other side, his face still hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood another man, tall and imposing, his eyes cold and calculating. David's pulse quickened. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The stranger stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I know you have questions," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "And I'm here to give you some answers. But you have to trust me. You have to come with us." David hesitated, his mind racing. Who were these men? What did they want from him? And why was this happening now? His instincts screamed at him to run, to protect his family from whatever danger these men brought. But something in the stranger's voice, something in his eyes, made him pause. "Trust you?" David echoed, his voice tight with suspicion. "I don't even know who you are. You show up out of nowhere, help my family, and now you want me to trust you? Why?" The stranger's gaze softened, and for a moment it seemed like he was searching for the right words. "I know this is hard to understand," he said quietly, "but there's more at play here than you realize. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you. But you need to come with us." We don't have much time. David glanced over his shoulder at Sarah, who had appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She could sense the tension in the air, the danger that seemed to be closing in. But she didn't know what to do. She didn't know who these men were or what they wanted from them. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" David's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he felt a surge of doubt. What if he was making a mistake? What if these men weren't who they claimed to be? But then he thought about everything they had been through: the hunger, the fear, the constant struggle. He thought about the man's words in the envelope: "You have a purpose." Maybe this was the answer, the chance to change everything. Maybe this was the moment that could turn their lives around. "Stay here," David said to Sarah, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. "I'll be back soon." With one last look at his wife and daughter, David stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The stranger and the other man led him down the darkened street, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The city seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something. David's heart raced with every step, each one taking him further from the safety of his family and closer to the unknown. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the cold night air biting at David's skin. He tried to make sense of the situation, but nothing added up. Who were these men? What did they want with him? And why had the stranger gone to such lengths to help his family? The questions swirled in his mind, but no answers came. Finally, they arrived at an old building, its windows dark and empty. The stranger turned to David, his expression serious. "This is where it begins," he said quietly. "Inside, you'll find the answers you're looking for. But once you enter, there's no turning back." David's stomach twisted with unease. "What do you mean, no turning back?" The stranger didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the door, signaling for David to enter. David hesitated, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. Something about the place felt wrong, as if it were a trap, a place designed to ensnare him. But the pull of curiosity, the need for answers, was too strong to ignore. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and strange artifacts, things that David couldn't even begin to identify. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging overhead. In the center of the room stood a large table, covered with papers, maps, and photographs. And standing behind the table was a man, an older man, his face worn with age and experience, his eyes sharp and calculating. David's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen him before. "David," the older man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been waiting for you." David's mind raced. How did this man know his name? Who was he? And why had the stranger brought him here? "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "What is all this? What do you want from me?" The older man smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent a chill down David's spine. "I think you already know," he said. "You've been looking for answers, haven't you? You've been wondering why your life has taken this turn, why you've been struggling, why you've been pushed to the brink. But the truth is, you've always been part of something bigger. Something much bigger than you could ever imagine." David's heart pounded in his chest. "What are you talking about?" The older man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving David's. "Your family has a legacy, a purpose, and you've been chosen to fulfill it." David's mind reeled. Legacy? Purpose. What was this man talking about? And why did it feel like everything he had been through, every hardship, had led him to this moment? Before David could respond, the stranger who had brought him here stepped forward, his face serious. "It's time for you to know the truth. You've been living in the dark for too long. The answers are here, but they won't be easy to accept." David's pulse quickened. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling, and the weight of the unknown was pressing down on him. He had come looking for answers, but now that he was here, He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. The older man's gaze never wavered, and the stranger stood silently by, waiting for David to make his next move. David's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and doubt. What was happening? What was the truth? And what did it mean for his family? He had come this far, but now, standing on the edge of everything he thought he knew, he wasn't sure if he was ready to take the final step. David stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The older man's words echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. Your family has a legacy, a purpose, and you've been chosen to fulfill it? What could that possibly mean? He had never felt like he was part of anything bigger than himself. He was just a father, trying to keep his family together, trying to survive in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. And yet, here he was standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by people who spoke of legacies and purposes he couldn't understand. The tension in the room was palpable. The stranger stood motionless, his eyes locked on David, waiting for him to process the gravity of the situation. The older man, too, seemed to be watching him closely, as if waiting for something to click in David's mind. But nothing made sense. The questions piled up, each one more urgent than the last. What was this legacy they spoke of? Why had they come for him now? And why did it feel like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't control? David's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from behind him. He spun around, his body tensing instinctively. The door to the room had creaked open, and standing there, silhouetted in the dim light, was Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "David, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I heard voices, and Before she could finish, the older man's eyes flicked to her, his expression darkening. "She shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath, but it was too late. Sarah had already stepped inside, her gaze moving between David, the stranger, and the older man. David felt a surge of panic. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here." But before he could say more, the stranger moved quickly, stepping between David and Sarah. "It's too late for you to leave now," he said, his voice low and cold. "You've already been drawn into this. All of you." David's stomach dropped. What did he mean by that? He turned to the older man, his voice rising with urgency. "What's going on? What's happening? Why are you involved with my family?" The older man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile that made David feel like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. "You've been chosen, David," the older man said slowly. "Chosen to carry out something much bigger than yourself. Your family is at the heart of it all." David's mind was reeling. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping. His eyes darted to Sarah, who looked just as confused and terrified as he felt. This doesn't make any sense. "I'm just trying to keep my family safe. That's all I've ever wanted. And now you're telling me that we're part of some legacy, some purpose? What kind of game is this?" The stranger's expression remained impassive. "It's not a game," he said quietly. "It's the truth. You've been living in the shadows for too long. Your family's past is tied to something much older, something far more powerful than you can imagine." David's head spun. A legacy? A past? He had no idea what these men were talking about. The only thing he knew for sure was that they had dragged his family into something dangerous, something that was spiraling out of control. Then, just as David opened his mouth to demand more answers, there was another sound, a loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps rushing toward the building. David's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to protect Sarah and Lily, but the stranger's hand shot out, grabbing his arm and holding him in place. "You need to stay calm," the stranger said urgently. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" David asked, his voice tight with panic. "What's happening? What do you mean they're coming?" The older man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of fear in his gaze. "They know you're here," he said, his voice low and strained. We need to move quickly. David's pulse raced as the realization hit him. Who were they? The threat that had been hanging in the air suddenly felt real, and he could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. He had no idea what was going on, but whatever it was spiraling out of control fast. The stranger turned to the older man. We don't have much time. We need to get out of here before it's too late. David's mind was racing. Get out! But where would they go? What was happening? And why was he being dragged into this chaos? Suddenly, the door to the room burst open, and a group of men in dark clothing stormed in. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning the room with a cold intensity. David's heart raced. These men were not here to help. They were here to take control. The stranger stepped forward, blocking David and Sarah from view. Stay back, he warned, his voice sharp and commanding. You don't want to do this. But the men didn't listen. One of them lunged toward the older man, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the ground. You've been hiding too long, the man hissed. It's time to finish what we started. David's mind was a blur of confusion and fear. What was happening? Who were these men? What did they want with the older man? And then, just as quickly as it had started, the fight erupted. The stranger and the men exchanged quick, violent blows, each one more intense than the last. David felt a wave of panic flood over him. He needed to protect Sarah, but he didn't know how. He didn't know who to trust. The room was filled with chaos shouts, crashes, and the sound of fists hitting flesh. And in the midst of it all, David realized something. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. As the fight raged on, David's eyes caught a glimpse of something on the table, the papers, the maps, the photographs. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized something in the images. One of the photos showed a familiar face. His face. But it wasn't just him. It was a photo of him and Sarah, standing together with someone else, a man he didn't recognize. But the face was unmistakable. It was the face of the stranger. David's blood ran cold. The stranger was connected to his family. He always had been. The realization hit him like a freight train. Everything, the food, the help, the cryptic messages, it was all part of something much darker, something that had been hidden from him for years. And now, the stakes had never been higher. But just as the pieces began to fall into place, a loud crash shook the room. The door flew open, and in the doorway stood a figure tall, menacing, and unmistakably familiar. David's heart stopped. It was the man from the photograph. The man who had been standing next to him and Sarah. But this time, there was no mistaking it. This man wasn't a stranger. He was family. David stood frozen, his mind racing. The man who had just stepped into the room was someone he recognized, but the recognition didn't make any sense. He had seen him in that photograph, standing next to Sarah and him. But how? Who was he? Why was he here now after all this time? The man's eyes locked onto David's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something regret, maybe, or recognition. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating look. The stranger who had been guiding David through this twisted ordeal stepped forward, his posture tense. David, listen to me, the stranger said, his voice urgent. This man, he's not who you think he is. He's not part of your family. He's here to finish what he started. David's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed for answers, but he couldn't make sense of it all. What was going on? The man in the doorway, the one from the photograph, took a step closer. You've been looking for the truth, haven't you? He said, his voice low and smooth. Well, here it is. David's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Who are you? Why are you doing this? The man smiled, a smile that was both reassuring and terrifying. I'm the one who's been watching over you, David. I'm the one who set everything in motion. You and your family. You've been part of a plan long before you even knew it. David's mind spun. A plan? He turned to the stranger, desperate for clarity. What's he talking about? Why didn't you tell me the truth? The stranger's face was grim. Because the truth is too dangerous. You weren't ready for it. And neither was Sarah. David's eyes flicked to Sarah, who stood beside him, her face pale and filled with fear. She didn't know what was happening any more than he did. But the tension in the air was suffocating, and David felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't control. The man in the doorway stepped forward again, his gaze never leaving David. You were always meant to be part of this, David. Your family. It's not just about survival. It's about power. A power that's been passed down through generations. And now, it's your turn to take up the mantle. David shook his head, confusion and anger boiling inside him. I don't want any part of this. I just want to protect my family. That's all I care about. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, David saw something cold and menacing in his eyes. You don't have a choice, David. You never did. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around them. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that made David's skin crawl. He could feel it now, the weight of something much larger than himself, something ancient and dangerous. The power that the man spoke of wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, and it was tied to his family in ways he couldn't yet understand. You've been chosen, the man continued, his voice growing colder. Chosen to lead. Chosen to carry out the legacy that's been waiting for you. David's mind raced. A legacy? Was this what the stranger had been talking about all along? Had his family been involved in something far darker than he had ever imagined? Before he could respond, the older man, who had been standing silently until now, spoke up. David, you have to understand. This isn't just about power. It's about survival. The legacy is not a gift, it's a responsibility. And if you don't take your place, everything will be lost. David's heart skipped a beat as the older man's words sank in. A sacrifice? The world around him seemed to blur as the weight of the revelation crashed down on him. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed about protecting his family, had been a lie. The power, the legacy, the destiny, none of it was his to claim. He wasn't the heir. He was the one meant to fall. The room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah, who'd been standing beside him, looked just as stunned, her face pale with shock. She reached out to David, her hand trembling as she grasped his. David, what does this mean? What's going on? David couldn't find the words. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. He turned to the stranger, the man who had guided him through this twisted journey. But the stranger's face was unreadable, his eyes distant. You knew, didn't you? David's voice was hoarse with emotion. You knew what was going to happen. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving David. I didn't want you to know, he said quietly. I wanted to protect you, but the truth was always there, waiting for you. David's mind raced. The truth? What truth? What had he been a part of all this time? The stranger continued, his voice low and filled with regret. The family you thought you knew. It's not the whole story. Your bloodline is tied to something far older, far more dangerous. And now, you've reached the point where the cycle must be completed. The man in the doorway stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. You think you have a choice, David? But you don't. The moment you were born, your fate was sealed. And now, it's time to fulfill it. David's pulse raced. Fate? He had always believed in free will, in making his own choices. But now, everything was slipping through his fingers, like sand in the wind. His family's future, his own future, was tied to something he couldn't control. The stranger, who had been standing in the background, took a step forward. David, there's no time left. You need to make a choice. The power is yours to claim, but only if you're willing to accept the consequences. David's mind was a storm of confusion and fear. He didn't know what to do. His heart told him to protect Sarah and Lily, to run and never look back. But deep down, he knew that the choices he made now would determine the course of his family's future. Suddenly, the older man stepped forward, his face filled with urgency. "David, listen to me. You can't do this alone. You need to trust the stranger. He's the key to unlocking your family's legacy." David turned to the stranger, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you warn me?" The stranger's face softened, and for a moment there was a flicker of empathy in his eyes. "I couldn't. You weren't ready. But now you are." David's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. But just as he was about to make a decision, a loud crash shook the room, and the door flew open again. This time, it wasn't just a few men. It was an army, dozens of armed figures, all dressed in black, their eyes cold and determined. David's heart sank. Who were they? What did they want? The man in the doorway turned, his expression hardening. "It's too late," he said, his voice resigned. "They've come to take what's theirs." David's blood ran cold. The power. The legacy. It wasn't just about his family. It was about something much bigger. Something dangerous. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The man in the doorway wasn't just a relative. He was the leader of a faction, a group that had been watching David's family for generations. And now, they were here to claim what they believed was theirs. But just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The stranger stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "No," he said firmly. "This ends now." David watched in disbelief as the stranger raised his hand, and the room seemed to pulse with an energy that made his skin tingle. The armed figures froze, their faces contorted in confusion and fear. The stranger's power was undeniable. He wasn't just a guide, he was a force to be reckoned with. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, the stranger turned to David. "You don't have to do this alone. But you have to decide now. Will you take your place, or will you fight for your family?" David's mind raced, the weight of the decision crushing him. Take my place? Fight for my family? He knew what he had to do. But just as he was about to make his choice, the final twist came. The older man, who had been silent all this time, stepped forward and revealed the truth that no one had expected. "David, there's one thing you don't know. You've already made your choice. And it's not what you think." David's heart stopped. What did he mean? And then the shocking truth was revealed. David wasn't the heir. He was the sacrifice. David's heart skipped a beat as the older man's words sank in. A sacrifice? The world around him seemed to blur as the weight of the revelation crashed down on him. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed about protecting his family, had been a lie. The power, the legacy, the destiny, none of it was his to claim. He wasn't the heir. He was the one meant to fall. The room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah, who had been standing beside him, looked just as stunned, her face pale with shock. She reached out to David, her hand trembling as she grasped his. "David? What does this mean? What's going on?" David couldn't find the words. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. He turned to the stranger, the man who had guided him through this twisted journey. But the stranger's face was unreadable, his eyes distant. "You knew, didn't you?" David's voice was hoarse with emotion. "You knew what was going to happen?" The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving David. "I didn't want you to know," he said quietly. "I wanted to protect you, but the truth was always there, waiting for you." David's mind raced. The truth? What truth? What had he been a part of all this time? The stranger continued, his voice low and filled with regret. The family you thought you knew. It's not the whole story. Your bloodline is tied to something far older, far more dangerous. And now, you've reached the point where the cycle must be completed. David's breath caught in his throat. The cycle? What cycle was he talking about? He turned to the older man, his eyes pleading for answers. Tell me what's going on. Why is this happening? The older man met his gaze, his expression grim. Your family's legacy isn't about power or control. It's about balance. And sometimes, to restore that balance, a sacrifice must be made. You were always the one chosen, David. The one who would give everything to ensure the survival of the rest. David felt the floor beneath him shift. A sacrifice. The word echoed in his mind, filling him with dread. His mind flashed back to the moments when he had felt something was off, when he had felt like there was more to this story than he had been told. But he had never imagined this. He had never imagined that he was the one who would have to pay the price. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, trembling with fear. David, please tell me this isn't true. Tell me you're not. I don't have a choice, Sarah, David interrupted, his voice raw. I never did. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. David felt the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its intensity. The stranger's face softened, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. I'm sorry, the stranger said quietly, but this was always your fate. David's heart ached as he turned to Sarah. She looked at him with such love and desperation, her eyes filled with unspeakable fear. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from this cruel reality, but he knew there was no escaping it. The sacrifice had to be made. And he was the one who had been chosen. But just as the tension in the room reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The door to the room flew open once again, and this time, it wasn't just armed figures standing in the doorway. It was Lily, David's daughter, standing there, her face filled with determination. Dad, what's going on? Lily asked, her voice steady but filled with confusion. I heard everything. What's happening? David's heart broke at the sight of his daughter. She was too young to understand the gravity of the situation, too innocent to be caught in the web of power and sacrifice that had ensnared their family. But in that moment, David realized something. He couldn't let her become part of this. He couldn't let her suffer the same fate. The older man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Lily. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice cold. This doesn't concern you. But Lily stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. I'm not leaving without my dad. I don't care what's going on. I'm not going to let you hurt him. David's heart swelled with pride at his daughter's courage. She was just a child, but she had the strength of a lion. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to her. Lily, you don't understand. This is bigger than us. It's something that's been set in motion for generations. Lily shook her head, her voice firm. I don't care about that. I care about you. And I'm not going to let you be taken away from us. David's chest tightened as he looked into his daughter's eyes. She was right. He had been so focused on protecting his family from the outside world, from the dangers he couldn't control, that he had forgotten what really mattered. It wasn't the legacy, the power, or the sacrifice. It was his family, and he would do anything to keep them safe. In that moment, David made a choice. A choice that would change everything. He turned to the stranger, his voice steady. I won't be your sacrifice. I won't let you use me to fulfill your twisted legacy. I will protect my family, no matter the cost. The stranger's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, respect, maybe, or resignation. You can't escape it, David. The legacy is in your blood. It's not something you can walk away from. David's gaze never wavered. I don't need your legacy. I need my family. With those words, the room seemed to shift. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, David felt a surge of power within himself, an unfamiliar force, one that he had never known existed. The legacy wasn't just something imposed upon him. It was something he could control. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He turned to Sarah and Lily, his eyes filled with determination. "We're leaving. Now, now!" Without another word, he grabbed their hands and led them toward the door. The stranger made no move to stop them, his expression unreadable. The older man, too, remained silent, watching them with a strange, almost wistful look in his eyes. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had made his choice, and nothing would stop him from protecting his family. As they stepped out into the night, the world seemed to shift. The danger, the mystery, the power, it all seemed to fade into the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, David felt like he was in control of his own fate. But as they walked into the unknown, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There were still questions left unanswered, still pieces of the puzzle that hadn't fallen into place. The legacy, the sacrifice, the power, these were not things that could be easily forgotten. And yet, as he held Sarah and Lily close, he realized something important. The true power wasn't in the legacy. It wasn't in the bloodline or the history. The true power was in the love he had for his family, the bond that tied them together. As they walked into the future, David knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be challenges, and there would be sacrifices. But he was ready. Because now, he understood what really mattered. And nothing could take that away from him. The legacy might have been set in motion long ago, but David had rewritten the ending. And for the first time in his life, he was free.